Hello everyone. You can hear me okay, because I can hear myself coming back as well. Um, Firstly, just thanks to all of you for coming out today. I mean, I know it's a Friday afternoon, right? Heading into the weekend, and especially as it's so sunny for the first time in a few days. Um, so firstly, just thanks. I have to say that when Andy asked me if I would do this, typically I'm not terribly fond of standing in front of people in front of a mic and speaking, but when Andy asked me if I would, one, because I had heard so much about the book already, we'd been talking about it and while he was in the process of working on it, and I was excited just to read it. And two, just because, as many of you know, Andy has been such a tremendous support to so many of us over the course of his time here at Pratt that there was no way I could say no. And now I'm glad I said yes, having read it, and I'm really eager to enter into a conversation with Andy. I have so many questions. First of all, just a little bit about Andy, or A.W. Barnes, as is on the book cover. He has a PhD in English literature and an MFA in creative writing. His nonfiction has appeared in Broad Street, Away Journal, Gertrude Press, and Sheepshead Review. His academic book, Post-Closet Masculinities in Early Modern England, was published by Bucknell University Press in 2009. I think many, if not all of you know, Andy as the wonderfully energetic Dean of the School of Liberal Arts and Sciences, a position that he's had for the past 8 years, during which, as I mentioned before, I've had the enormous pleasure of getting to know and work with him. Today, however, we're here to really for a reading and a discussion of his new book, The Dark Eclipse, Reflections on Suicide and Absence. The Dark Eclipse is a book of personal essays in which Andy seeks to come to terms with the suicide of his older brother, Mike, using source documentation, the police report, autopsy, suicide note, and death certificate. The essays explore Andy's relationship with Mike and their status as gay brothers raised in a large conservative Midwestern family. While the other members of his family seem to have forgotten about Mike, who died in 1993, Andy has not been able to let him go, and this book is an attempt to do so. The Lambda Literary Review rightly calls The Dark Eclipse a lyric noir of family instability, personal revelation, and queer inheritance, both genealogical and literary, while Peter Trachtenberg, author of the Book of Calamities, proclaims it to be powerful, often devastating, and proof, if proof were needed, that personal essay can be at once immensely intelligent and profoundly moving. I couldn't agree more. So it's with great pleasure that I invite A.W. Barnes to read.
Thank you, Ellery. I appreciate it. Thank you guys for coming out. I appreciate it. This is the first time I'm reading in public. It's the first time I'm reading from this book, so I'm happy to be doing it here in front of y'all. I'm just going to read for about 15 minutes, just the first couple of pages of the book, and then I'll come over here and Ellery can ask all those questions he wants to ask me, which kind of frightens me a little bit. So I'm just going to start reading from the very beginning. The Midtown North Police Precinct in Manhattan is located at 306 West 54th Street between 8th and 9th Avenues. It's a 4-story limestone building in the Art Deco style of Rockefeller Center. The windows, however, look cheap. Thin metal frames and single-pane sashes, some of which are propped open with pieces of wood. In a few of the windows, there are air conditioners that drip water down the front of the building and stain the facade. An oversized American flag is supported by a sturdy-looking metal pole bolted to the front of the building. The flag hangs low over the sidewalk. The precinct has 2 doors, both metal and painted an algae green. The doors are set back in the portal with angular ornamentation along the lintel. Above the door on the right, in the silver plates, is the precinct's number, 18th. And above the door on the left, it reads, Office. Despite the obvious signage, I'm standing across the street trying to decide which door to enter. I've been standing here for over 15 minutes. It's my shrink's idea to come here. He thinks that I lack the desire or the initiative to look squarely at the facts of my past and to determine what is true and what has been distorted by time. A police cruiser rolls down the street and turns into the alleyway next to the building, driving down a ramp to the back of the building where, I imagine, people who have been arrested are brought into the precinct building. It's a damp day in early May of 2015. My skin feels clammy beneath my work shirt and wool pants. I don't know whether to unzip my coat to get some air beneath my clothes or button up the coat collar to keep the dampness out. A young man in a graying t-shirt and a patchy beard walks a bulldog down the block toward me. The dog zigzags from one side of the sidewalk to the other, sniffing the edges of stoops and around trees and at the bottom of trash bags piled up on the curb. The guy is talking on his cell phone and doesn't pay attention to either the dog or to me. When they reach me, I have to step off the curb and into the street between two black sedans in order to let them pass. I can't decide which door of the precinct to enter because I'm trying to recall a memory that has become cloudy over the years. I've been to this building before, 22 years ago, after my older brother Mike died. I was with my parents then, and we'd come to collect Mike's personal effects, his watch and eyeglasses and wallet and address book. We entered through one of these doors. It seems important to remember which one if I want the memory of that day to come back to me clearly. It was a Saturday in late October of 1993. Mike's body had been found in a hotel room in Times Square, which is part of the 18th precinct. I was living in Minneapolis and flew in that Friday, spending the night in Mike's apartment. My parents had flown in that morning from Indianapolis, the hometown where Mike and I grew up. My parents and I had met at the medical examiner's office to identify Mike's body, and then we headed across town to the 18th precinct building. It was mid-morning, and traffic coming up First Avenue was sparse. My mother and I crossed against the light. She wrapped herself around my arm. My father, however, refused to move and stood stoically on the sidewalk on the east side of the avenue. There are laws for a reason, my father said when the light changed and he caught up to us. My mother and I pretended as if we hadn't heard my father, like children ignoring an annoying sibling. I had a sense that my mother had spent most of her married life ignoring my father, who, before they married, was studying to be a Trappist monk. The vow of celibacy was obviously too much for him. He overreacted to this failure, I thought, by fathering 7 sons and 1 daughter, my older brothers Tony, Joe, and Mike, my younger brothers Eddie, Rob, and Pat, and my only sister Marie and me stuck in the middle. Marie was 23 months older than I was, 8 children born within the span of 11 years from 1957 to 1968, a time when strict Catholics like my parents believed that birth control was an affront to God and the church. My father may have left the monastery, I thought, but not monasticism. I've had to learn to put aside the lessons he tried to teach me, moral rectitude, a myopic worldview, an intolerance for difference. Before we went to the police station, we stopped for lunch at a restaurant patronized by tourists who liked fried mozzarella sticks and nachos and overdressed Caesar salads. It wasn't yet noon and the restaurant was empty. We sat in a plywood booth. It was dark. It was a dark and cavernous place that smelled of cigarette smoke and wet carpet. As she nearly always did back then, my mother wore a light blue windbreaker, which she took off and hung on a hook next to the booth. She also wore pleated khakis and a pale blue Gap sweater over a white polo shirt with a collar that had curled under. After hanging up her windbreaker, she scooted into the booth. My father wore almost the identical outfit, although his windbreaker was off-white and his Gap sweater was a pale yellow. He too hung up his jacket and then scooted in opposite my mother. I wore black jeans and a green t-shirt. I was muscular and proud of my body then. I was 29 years old. In the gay community, it was normal for us to wear jeans and t-shirts regardless of the occasion. A night out at the club, a Sunday morning brunch, a funeral. I sat in the booth next to my mother. "I tell you this much," my father said as we waited for someone to take our order. "I get his money." My father had a nose that looked permanently swollen, as if it had been broken a few times and never set properly. This caused him to speak from the back of his throat, so that at times it was difficult to understand what he was saying. My mother constantly called him out for muttering, which angered my father and caused him to shout at her. When he made a claim on Mike's money, I heard him clearly. I wanted to believe that my father's greed was a sign of his grief. I wanted to believe that losing a son had made him angry, and that his anger had made him unexpectedly small. I told myself that he was in shock and didn't know what he was saying, but still, my hands were shaking. I wanted to grab his shoulders and say that fathers aren't supposed to say these things about their dead sons. I kept silent for a while. What did he expect me to say anyway? Was he itching for a fight? For me to call him out on such an inappropriate comment? Did he expect me to take him to task the way Mike used to when we were younger? The waitress finally showed up to take our order. I blamed my father for Mike's death. I still do. Mike and I grew up as gay sons in a household where my father's unbearable ethics made it impossible for us to live there. In order to survive, Mike and I both abandoned Indianapolis. He moved to New York. I bounced from city to city until I too landed in New York a few years after Mike died. Although we no longer lived under my father's oppressive influence, the weight of our upbringing was difficult to carry. Even now, after Mike's been dead for a long time, and I have lived more years away from Indianapolis than I lived there, I feel a tightening in my chest when I think of my father. As we waited in the booth for our food, my mother leaned her body into mine. She'd spent most of my childhood doing this. It was obvious to her early on that my father and I would always be at odds. I was a sensitive boy who was nothing like him. My father was tough and dispassionate. My mother would periodically rub my back or run her fingers through my hair. We'd stand next to each other in the church pew, dutifully giving our liturgical responses, and she'd wrap her pinky around mine. I don't know if my mother ever did these things for Mike. I don't think she did. Mike was abrasive and offensive like the rest of my 5 brothers. But lately, I've come to think that Mike's aggressive nature was an act he adopted in order to protect himself. I couldn't bear sitting across from my father in the restaurant. I wanted to believe that when Mike died, he left me with a little bit of courage he had to stand up to my father. To tell my father, for example, that I've dreamt of being a writer since I was a boy. We didn't come from a family of writers, or one that appreciated writers, or any kind of artists. I was sure if I made this declaration to my father, he'd laugh at me. Perhaps we should give it to charity, I suggested about Mike's money. I sat on my hands to stop them from shaking, like God's love we deliver. Beneath the table, my mother placed her hand on top of my thigh. "What's that?" my father asked. He'd taken the salt and pepper shakers and placed them in front of him as if he were claiming ownership of them. "A charity," I repeated, "that helps people who are sick." "What kind of people?" I didn't answer him. God's Love We Deliver was a charity established to bring food to gay men who were shut in their apartments and dying of AIDS. My father believed that homosexuality was a choice made by immoral people who had fallen so far from grace that they were a lost cause. My father believed this even of his own gay sons. "We could talk about it later," my mother said. My mother took her hand away and rearranged the silverware in front of her. My father pulled out a napkin from a metal dispenser on the table and laid it in his lap. A busboy came by and set glasses of ice water in front of each of us. I took a gulp of water from mine. "I'm determined to live my own life," I said suddenly. "I don't feel as if I owe it to anyone to live in a certain way." "That's right, darling," my mother said, rubbing my back. "You owe something to me," my father said. I wasn't looking at my father, but instead across the empty restaurant. If I looked at him, I was sure that I'd lose my nerve. "That's not how I see it," I said. "Well, you see a lot of things wrong," my father told me. "I'm my own person," I insisted, looking down at my silverware. "You are indeed," my mother said. She folded her hands in her lap and looked at my father as if she were trying to prevent him from doing anything rash. "The problem with this country," my father said, "is that people have forgotten that a debt has always got to be repaid." My father came from a long line of hard-working men, of railroad workers and boilermakers who had in turn descended from Scottish laborers. He grew up in Indianapolis with no money and little hope of escaping the blue-collar lives of his father and grandfather. But he had been tough and self-reliant, going to college on an athletic scholarship and, after serving in the Korean War, finding a job as a gym teacher. He raised a family of 8 children on a gym teacher's salary and an ethics of self-sufficiency. He was a Reagan Republican through and through. My father was a man who pulled himself up by his own bootstraps and had little pity for anyone who couldn't do the same. "That's enough, Frank," my mother said. "It's not right," my father said. "It's simply not right." The waitress returned with our order. We ate as if we were starving. Given our history and the improbability of changing my relationship with my father, when Mike died, I thought I'd have a chance to fix things with my father. Couldn't Mike's death be the necessary jolt that closed the chasm between us? Couldn't my father and I put aside what religious or political convictions we held in order to accept one another as we were? At the very least, I wanted my father to give up his belief that being gay was a death sentence. When he was finished eating, my father pushed his plate away. It bumped into my mother's, and she looked at him as if she'd kicked him under the table. My father looked around for the waitress. He saw the busboy and tried to get his attention by snapping his fingers. The busboy ignored him. My father took a sip of his water and tightened his face as if the water were stale. "It's not your fault," I said under my breath, hoping that only my mother would hear me. "Damn right it's not," my father said, thinking that I was speaking to him. Unlike my father, my mother blamed herself for Mike's death. She had told me this when I spoke with her on the phone before my parents flew to New York. My mother looked at me now. Her eyes watered. If we were alone, I thought she'd ask me how I could be certain that Mike's death wasn't her fault. She'd ask me to help her understand what had happened. She'd ask for forgiveness. I would hold her hand and say that it was going to be all right, that grief was bound to subside and leave behind just a trace of what she was feeling at that moment. I hoped that this would also be true for me. "Excuse me," my father yelled across the restaurant. The busboy looked at my father but didn't respond immediately. Instead, he took a large glass of something from the waiter's stand and took a long drink before heading over to our table. "Can you tell our waitress to bring our check?" my father said when he arrived. The busboy gathered up our empty plates in silence and retreated into the kitchen. My father pulled out his wallet and placed it squarely on the table in front of him. Before the bill arrived, I stood up and allowed my mother to slip out of the booth. She took her jacket from the hook and put it on. "We'll be outside," she said to my father. I followed her out of the restaurant. "He doesn't mean it," my mother said as we stood on the sidewalk. She took out a balled-up Kleenex from her jacket pocket and wiped her nose. He's just angry. My mother was tougher than I ever gave her credit for being. If my father is to be lauded for having raised 8 children on a gym teacher's salary, my mother was the one who bore us one after the other with barely a respite, seeming always to have been pregnant, as every photo of our childhoods attests. She was the one at home feeding us, changing our diapers, bathing us, washing our clothes, comforting us when we were ill or grieved, scolding us when we misbehaved. She took the brunt of the force that 8 children packed so closely together in age inevitably brings. We should talk about this, I said, reaching up and rubbing her shoulders as if I were suddenly the caregiver in our relationship. We will, she said. She placed her palms flat on my chest and I lowered my arms, but not now. My father came out of the restaurant struggling to get his jacket on. He had his right arm in the jacket sleeve, but couldn't get his hand back far enough to get the left arm in. My mother helped him. I hailed a cab. Thank you. Are they on?
Just the little switch there. There we go.
I need a microphone. Thanks.
Andy, this is such an amazing book, and I felt like while reading it, one of the things as I went through, the book itself is the collection of essays, but the essays connect so nicely together that it's often been, in terms of when it's been reviewed, considered a memoir. So that I've noticed in reading some of the reviews of the book, some describe it as a memoir, some describe it as a series of essays, because it encapsulates a very specific period of time, and the way that it's connected. In revealing the central discussion about your brother and the suicide and those things, it means that it often does read in that way. One of the things I was most struck by is that how it interweaves these incredibly dense themes of family, relationships within family, brothers and sister, or brother with brother, parents. It even hints at the relationship between your father and your mother, all of those complex relationships, but also broader themes like homophobia and the nature of literature in life and how we read these things. There's all these complex interweavings that for me, in the end, the themes that seem to be to undergird all of them were these themes of love and shame. And the idea, the interplay between the two of them, and that this deep level of shame that maybe only love can overcome, and also who survives shame and how and who doesn't, and if there's survivor's guilt once you survive it and someone else doesn't. That seemed to be such a deep thing. But even in discussing the notion of shame, one of the things I wanted to do was talk about the broader context, because certainly there's the familial shame and the notion of the father as this ever-present figure that's very strict and very moral and very religious and unyielding in the way that he presents that morality. But there's also the sense of the time period. These essays take place in the early 90s.
That's right.
And I hope it's not a spoiler alert because we didn't talk about it there, but your brother had HIV, was HIV positive.
So he said.
So he
We're not
said,
quite sure.
but we're not quite sure. Though there was his own personal documentation,
That's
which we'll
right.
talk about. But the notion of the time period also being a part of that shame, because you write a lot about your own sexuality in this and what it meant. If we could just sort of talk about that broader notion and then move into the sort of specifics of the family again.
Yeah. I mean, the book takes place, it really, my brother died in 1993. So it really is looking at our relationship in the late 80s and early 90s when to be gay was something different than it is today in many communities. In many communities, to be gay now is okay, whatever. Not at all. Certainly not back where I come from. It's still not easy to be out and to be gay. But back in the 80s and 90s, there was, as you well know, there's so much shame involved in being gay. There's so much anger involved, and there's a lot of fear about being gay because you never knew. You never knew what person could hurt you, what person could you meet that could do harm to you, which happened to a lot of us. So that is true that it is historically specific to that time period. But at least for me, when I go back to my family, not much has changed. A lot of that shame is still there. Although a lot of you know my husband David, they know David, they accept David, but underneath that acceptance, and my family are still very Republican, very conservative, but underneath all of that is still the same atmosphere, still the same. I go back there and I still have huge amounts of anxiety because not a lot has changed.
Well, and I think even in terms of the essays and the subject when we're dealing with your brother, we also have to throw the notion of HIV in there,
Yeah.
and the notion of AIDS
That's right.
in the 90s, and which was certainly for most people a death sentence, right?
That's right.
And so, in the book, when your brother is thinking of himself as being a person that's HIV positive or possibly with AIDS at that point, and feeling like the book starts off with the suicide letter.
This is this book is constructed on documents. So I took, every essay is based on a document. And the very first document is I reproduced a suicide note that I received at the police precinct. I'll tell a quick story if I may. That when this first essay, it leads us going to the 18th Police Precinct. So the next scene is we arrive there, and a police woman grabs my arm and took me into a separate room, and my parents into another room, and she handed me my brother's suicide note. And she said, your parents are going to love this note. Okay. And I read this note, and they did love it. But in this note, he claimed that, he didn't say HIV, actually. That was in that document. But he disavowed being gay, and he said that more than anything, he wanted to live back in Indianapolis, be married with children. He thought my father was the best thing in the world, and it was a very sort of disturbing thing. So I chose to start this book by reproducing this note that he had addressed to me and to the rest of the family to get a sense of what was going on in Mike's head and why he decided to kill himself, because so much internalized homophobia.
I think that the note is interesting too in the sense that there's this theme that runs through it of betrayal, right? Of sort of your brother's betrayal of you. There's a way in which there's almost an unrequited fraternal love story between you and your brother that's
Yes.
there. So that your brother is this person that you find out was gay and sort of had presented himself as living this gay life of being in New York, going to Fire Island, traveling around, sort of fabulousness. And this was pre-Will and Grace, right? So there was no notion of that was happening already on the television screen. But your brother sort of was presenting himself as this person, and at the same time you were coming out, and that was not the life that you were living. Right. That at some point you felt like if you could only win somehow your brother's adoration and respect, that maybe that would unlock your shame and your guilt, that there was a connection between love and shame in that sense, which was witnessed when he came to visit you in Washington, right? So I guess the question that I would ask in that notion of how he presented himself to you, and that notion of this almost unrequited chasing after his affection, that note in the end where or the note that you began with, and as you deconstruct that note again as we get to the end of the final essay, in which he says that he disavows his life as a gay man, that comes as a kind of betrayal after the betrayal of his publicly outing you.
Yes, yes. That's one of the letters I talk about. A letter I've never seen, that my brother had outed himself to my family, wrote a letter to my family, photographed it without telling me, sent it to every one of them, said that he was gay, and then signed it and said, P.S. Andy is too. And then he went on vacation. That was my brother. So that when my family got it, they all had to call me. And I was like, what letter are you talking about? So this was typical of my brother. My brother was 3.5 years older than I was. I looked just like him. I sounded like him. I had the same mannerisms as he had. When I was growing up, people called me Mike all the time. All the time. And when I was growing up, I knew that I was a gay kid. I didn't know Mike was. And I thought, again, back in the 70s and 80s, I was the only gay person on the face of the earth. Because I had no context, in especially where I grew up. So, and my brother Mike was a golden child. He, a straight A student, went to the University of Notre Dame, went Duke Law School, worked on Wall Street as a lawyer. I was a B student. I was a moody middle child. So I adored him. And when we realized we were gay, I adored him even more because I thought, someone who understands what I went through, someone who understands how difficult my childhood was. What I misunderstood was that was not his childhood. His childhood was not difficult. And so I did feel betrayed at the out letter, and I certainly felt betrayed at the suicide note because he disavowed being gay, and I thought, well, where does that leave me? And he gave this. My father did take this letter. He loved this letter, my father, and he took it and he went to our parish priest to prove that my brother had disavowed his gayness, to prove that he had repented in the end, so that he could be buried in Catholic cemetery in holy ground. So yeah, it was an unrequited love story is a good way of putting it.
Well, I think that there's so much about the nature of love in this, right? Yeah. And that as we move through it in reading, even from the very beginning, there's a way that there's almost an archaeological nature to it, that you are finding these artifacts of who your brother was, right? These artifacts that are left behind, and that you then begin investigating them closer and closer. And then you have these essays, which are sort of these meditations on those artifacts. And so the book, in a sense, is centered on each one of these different elements that he's found and he's going through to discover. And it sort of then begins to, there's a sense of expansion, almost a Baroque sense of expansion and contraction as we sort of move through the piece, that we are sort of being moved into a room in which there's an artifact, and then the things that are around that begin to get explained. There's a very spatial sense to the way that this is written. I can almost feel myself moving through it in that way. And at the same time, the way that you actually manipulate time. There's a complete, almost prismatic view of each moment that sort of begins to expand and contract around these artifacts. The question that I have is, it was interesting that you started and you read it just now, that your therapist had encouraged you to confront most directly the facts of the situation. Is that how these essays began?
Very much so. My brother's been dead for 25 years now. I've been trying to write about him for 20 years, and I've written 3 other books before this one, and those books, I threw them in the trash because they weren't getting at what I wanted to get at. And the problem was I've been telling the story of Mike's death for decades because I just made a lot of assumptions. And finally my shrink said to me, there's a police report. And I went, really? Why would there be a police report? And he was like, yeah, there would be an autopsy. Why don't you go look at the facts first, find what the facts are, and then you can figure out what the story is. And so two things happened. So that happened. At the same time, I had begun my MFA at Bennington College while I was here. And one of my mentors, my first semester, I began writing yet another book about my brother, another version of the book about my brother. In the second semester, I had Susan Cheever was my mentor. And she had said offhandedly, I'm waiting for the memoirist who writes a book on their driver's license. And I thought, that's a cool idea. So those two things sort of triggered, that's a great way to structure a book that is deeply personal and deeply emotional because I can ground it in the facts. And facts have, in one sense, have no sort of emotional content. So I could ground it there, and then, I love the analogy you made, then I could look around the room and see what these facts mean about the story of my brother and about me.
I'm glad that you bring up this notion of sort of grounding it in the facts, because I think that's the memoirist's question often, right? Is it's not just the facts. And it's interesting, just listening today on WNYC, they were talking about facts as we were living in a world in which we're trying to decide, what those mean and the interpretation. And I think that that is always the difficulty of the memoirist, is the interpretation of the facts and the intersection of memory. And one part of this is when I was reading the essay in which you talk about your father going in with you and your mother at the time to actually view the body, which you didn't get the opportunity to do. Instead, they gave you a Polaroid that you looked at, right? And your father almost denying that that was your brother Mike, right? By sort of just saying, denying that that resembles him. And your mother, once again, as you mentioned, being the strong person who would just step in and say, yes, that's him. But your father also saying that people who live that way deserve to die that way. In your memory, that's what he said. And later, as you've repeated this to family members, they're saying that couldn't have been what he said, or his grief is what made him say. And even your own inner discussion about whether that was provoked by grief or some other thing. And so the question that I would say is that in going back and writing this one, how much did you rely on your interpretation of those facts and memory of the things that surrounded it? And two, has your family read the book?
Those are two excellent questions. The first one is that the reason that when my brother died and I heard it and I was living in Minneapolis, the reason I came to New York is I felt an obligation. I was his only gay brother, and it was my responsibility to claim him. Sorry about that.
No.
So I felt I needed to be there, not just my parents. I knew what my parents would do. I knew what my father would do. My father would sweep in, take his body, and bury it back in Indiana, which he did. So I felt an obligation to be there. And when I was there, we were in the morgue, and my father knew that Mike and I were gay, and he did come up and point a finger directly at me and said, anyone who lives this kind of lifestyle deserves to die this way. And my father knew that in my teens and my 20s, I had several suicide attempts, and I had checked myself into mental institutions because it was an incredibly difficult childhood I had to go through. And so my siblings, when I told them this story, they said, you can't take that as truth, because he was grieving. And I remember that moment as crystal clear, because there are those moments, and we know this from the Kavanaugh hearings, right? There are these moments that memory records them exactly, because they have so much emotional strength to them. And I recall that moment as clear as day. So, but my family, they don't believe me. They don't believe a lot of things about me. They don't believe me primarily because my family's very cultish. I'm the only one and Mike was the only one that lived away from my family home, from Indianapolis. I have 7 siblings or 6 siblings, and all their grandchildren, everyone lives within 5 miles of my mother and father's house. So my brother and I were left, and we were seen as betrayers of the family because we left. We left the cult. The question, and I had to leave it because that childhood, that family, that place is an immensely toxic place to go, for me. And I go home very rarely, and it's still extremely toxic. And if you've ever survived trauma, one thing you know is that you have to, in order to survive, and this is one reason why my brother didn't, you have to create very strict boundaries that protects yourself from the environment or from people, even family members, who are the cause of the toxicity. So I have very strict boundaries with my family. I go home very rarely, and when I go home, they are allowed to have access to certain parts of my life, but not all of my life. And the writing part of my life, they have no access to. I don't give them access to it. So I didn't tell them I was writing this book. I didn't interview them for this book. I didn't let them know about this book. I have 17 nieces and nephews. They're great, actually. Some of them know about the book, and some have read about this book. So I don't know if my brothers and sisters have read it, or my parents. I don't care if they haven't. I honestly don't care what their reaction to this book is. And that's simply the way I survive.
As one of 8 children, especially during the time period that you're talking about, I couldn't help but remember being your peer in age, that television series 8 is Enough,
Yes.
with all of those sort of kids running around and,
Way
and
too
that
many.
sort
It
of
is
thing.
way too many.
Yeah, yeah. And yet, even with the sort of 7 siblings, and the way that your mother and your clear love for your mother that's mentioned in the book, the sort of conflictual love in the book seems to be almost a sort of triangle between you, your father, and your brother. Is it okay if I read just very quickly and where I felt
Sure.
like it came?
he has a lot of sticky tabs in there. It makes me nervous.
Well, I teach a lot. Um, I think this was particularly resonated with me is that it's a moment in which Andy is sitting in his father's office, and his father had been an accountant his life, and now has fallen kind of ill and has become a much older man, right? And it becomes clear that his father needs something from him, whether it's just his attention or just to linger for a moment. And he uses this moment to sort of talk about his clients and all of these sorts of things, dealing with the accounting business, and just as a way of sort of keeping Andy there for a bit longer. And Andy's conflicted. He feels like he's doing a service for his father by sitting there, but doesn't want to stay. And then at a certain moment, he realizes his father is tired and that his sitting there is almost a punishment to his father. And yet he sort of weathers it out. And so I think it's beautifully written, the arc of that scene, in which it goes from being something that your father feels like he's giving to you, that you're sort of just taking in and accepting, to a realization that you actually have some power in just sort of staying there beyond your father's will to give. And then we get here where you write, if I were a good son, I'd take whatever affection my father was willing to give and excuse the rest. But I am also a brother who has a duty to protect the memory of a sibling who was lowered into the ground with the curse of his father on his head. I cannot reconcile these two demands. And I felt like that was one of the moments in the book. There are many, but that was one of the moments in the book in which there seemed to be a kind of clarity of the pull of family and individuality and all the external forces that were acting on you. Prior to that, there's a scene in another essay in which you and your brother are at the family home, and your brother says to you, we're at the lake house, I believe, and your brother says to you, you have to forgive him. And having read that, and then I arrive at that moment, and I say, is that can you arrive in reconciling those two?
That's a good question. It points to two things. When I was a kid growing up, I knew two things for sure. I knew that my family hated gay people. They said it constantly. They said it constantly. And the word fag was used in our house constantly. I also assumed my family loved me. They didn't know I was gay. So I could never reconcile, still can't. How can they hate me and love me at the same time? Still can't figure that out. Still can't reconcile that. The other thing about my father, that's interesting that you asked that, because I'm writing a book. The book I'm writing now is called My Father's Body, a Book of Reconciliation. And what I'm trying to do is not necessarily to reconcile this person called my father, who is 89 and dying, but I'm trying to reconcile with those things, those aspects of me which belong to my father. I look like my father, bald head and all. I don't sound like him, thank God. But I have some of his traits as well. Some of his, and the question for me is, how do I reconcile with those parts of me? I can't reconcile with my father. I refuse to, because he cursed his sons. He caused one of his sons to die. I can't forgive that. But I can try to reconcile that part of me, that part of him that's in me, as it were. But I have to say, it is a choice of mine. I choose not to reconcile with him. I choose not to forgive him.
I would just want to, before opening it up, because I would like to find out if there are other people that have questions as well. But I think somehow, because I like David so much, your husband, that it would be remiss of me, and certainly in talking about the way that love is a force in this, and trying to, find a way to love oneself when one's family has told you that you're unlovable, right?
That's right.
These kinds of things. And also trying to create a love bond and relationship with a brother who seems to want to completely disown the entire family, you included, even if you have shared this connections, right? And then just at a moment in which you have felt like you may have found some clues to understanding yourself and getting past some of the desires that you did have for suicide in your own life, and they begin to return, you meet David.
Right.
And that was a point where you, in the actual essay yourself, say that you realized that only a certain kind of love would be able to help heal you.
That's right. David's not here. No, he's not. He's in class. My husband teaches here, interior design over here. There's this story that, the way I met David, I'll tell you quickly. I was living in Laguna Beach, California, and I had moved there because I felt that I needed a geographical shock to my system. I lived in the Midwest in this very flat place, and the landscape of the Midwest mirrors the ideology of Midwesterners. It's very flat. It's very monolithic. It's very unforgiving. And I moved to Southern California, and I lived on the cliffs in Laguna Beach, overlooking the Pacific Ocean. So I had this water, and I had these totally different geographic. So I needed that. At one point, I was working at the University of California, Irvine, as an administrative assistant, typing all day. And I had no money. And one day, I decided, in order to save money, I had hair then, and I decided I was going to cut my own hair. How difficult could it be? So I started cutting my own hair. And of course, when you get to the back, and I had, made some mistakes. So I had these, big stripes of hair. My hair was flying all over it. And so I looked in the mirror, and I was having a moment of crisis. And I called a friend of mine, and he said, "Just come visit me. Come visit me." So I drove to South Bend, Indiana, of all places, from Laguna Beach. And I arrived in South Bend, and my friend said he was working at this gay resort in South Bend. And my friend worked at the front desk at the motel, and this other guy worked as a bartender in the bar. And he goes, go see this guy named David. He's in the bar. I'm not done working yet. So I did, and I met David. And so we spent 2 weeks together, and I got my little truck, and I was driving back to Southern California, and I had to stop in Wyoming, and David had told me before I left that it was his birthday. And I had a very clear moment, one of these very clear moments you get in life every once in a while, and this was it. I could just say goodbye to this guy. Hey, fun 2 weeks, it was awesome, great. Or I could stop, and I could choose to love him. And so I chose to love, and I sent him a postcard from Wyoming or Montana. I have the postcard, and I think I said, anyways. So I sent him this postcard. When I got back to Laguna Beach, every day for a month, I got a handmade postcard from David. So sweet. And then, and that was really the decision. I said, I can't live this life, the life I've been living, so I choose to do this. And we did, and we've been together for 26 years. But it was true. That love was a choice. I chose to love him, and that changed my life. In the same way, I choose not to do other things. Not to get sucked in with my family. It's a choice. But yeah, a certain kind of love can change everything.
Good. Can I go down and do, there's a mic that's there. Good.
Thank you very much for this discussion, and thank you for reading. I want to steer the conversation back to grounding the book in facts and documents. And the question is, in crafting this book and even in the editing process, did you encounter any documents that by choice you left out? And in hindsight, if you were to write the book again, you would include? Thank you.
Were there any documents I excluded, you say, and that I would have included? I don't know. I don't think so, because I was very particular in what documents I wanted, and what documents I could have access to. So, for instance, the letter that he outed me, I've never seen that letter. I've never seen it. I have no access to it. One of my brothers has it, and he won't give it to me. I know why he won't show it to me, because he doesn't want me to write about it. So I would have, on the contrary, I would have loved, and I still would love to see that letter, to see what, I heard about it over the years, and I've heard about it that it's, my brother was a lawyer. It was like 4 pages of legal size of notebook where, the one thing about my brother, I loved him dearly, and I still love him dearly. You're all adults. My brother was a complete asshole to everybody. To everybody. So I know in this letter he went through this long explanation of about his life and how all the accomplishments he's had and all this, and so what, he's gay, whatever, I've done all these things and I'm wonderful. And then he did this PSA. I would love to have seen that document, but I've forbidden access. It's behind some lock and key of my brother's house and won't give it to me. It's good. That's a good question.
Thank you for that reading, Andy. I'm really interested in how sometimes finding factual information actually opens up more aporia or more gaps, or we have this now especially infinite access to information, and yet somehow it seems like that the more expansive the archive is, the more questions one has somehow. And I'm just curious if, as you were writing and thinking about the documents that you were finding, were there certain documents that, revised your understanding of what happened to you or your brother, and also were there documents that then opened up more unanswerables, or what is the unanswerable for you? I mean, beyond death itself, obviously.
This is a question I've been asked a lot. I've been doing a radio book tours. I've been doing radio interviews across the country. I've done about 20 of them so far. And what people often tell me about in this book is that because my brother committed suicide, I don't whitewash his life, which happens to a lot of people when they commit suicide. We whitewash their life and we glorify them, and we have TV specials about them, how great they are, and we don't look at the messy part of their life. And I don't do this, and primarily because I knew that my brother committed suicide in a hotel in Times Square. I knew that. Because that's where he was found, that's what police told me. This is what my assumption was. My brother went to the hotel, he took whatever poison he took, laid down in bed, and went to sleep. When I got the police report and when I got the autopsy, no, he was found, oddly enough, in his underwear. Why? On the floor, next to the table where he was writing his suicide note. And he doesn't end his suicide note. His suicide note, the handwriting, it just falls and he collapses. So I had this romanticized view of, lying in bed perfectly. And so it really caused me to question, first of all, we know from studies, most people who commit suicide, it's spur of the moment action. Mike's was not. He went to Hong Kong to get the poison because you couldn't get it here. So he had planned this out. And also, most people don't leave suicide notes. It's very uncommon for a suicide person to leave a note. It's very uncommon. So this started my question, what was he thinking? At the last minute, did he decide, I have to write something? And so did he rush to this table and start writing this? And if that was the case, what does that mean about what he wrote? Was he in this kind of fog moment? But I also didn't know what kind of poison he took. He took pentobarbital, liquid pentobarbital. It's what vets use to put down dogs and cats. And liquid pentobarbital works extremely fast. So that also caused me to say, okay, so what did he do? Did he sit down on this table? Did he drink? He had 2 vodka tonics, and one of them was laced and one was not, and a bottle of NyQuil. This is all. I got this from the autopsy report that I know they did this. So did he set it all down? And so what was this scene? And I did. So that really complicated my ideas of what the last moments of his life were like, and I had romanticized them. And this complicated them greatly, which I talk about in the book, that it gives me some moment at least to say, did he have second thoughts? Did he, or at least to put that horrible, hateful note into some context. So
There was something else that you wrote about in terms of documentation and archival things, especially when it came to the police reports. It seemed that you were writing that said that reading the reports at times seemed so reductive of the person and the experience, and so that sense of the reductive sort of drove you further into a more expansive, forced you to go into an expansive way of looking at them, because it's just age, male, height, some descriptions of, average sex organ, whatever those things are, that are in some ways more dehumanizing and reductive of the experience of that person as well, right?
Yeah. I don't know if you've ever read an autopsy report. How many people have read an autopsy report here? When you read it, when I went to I had to go back to the morgue where I identified my brother. That was a traumatizing experience. I have to go back 20 years later in order to order an autopsy. And I didn't know what an autopsy, I didn't know what I was, so I had to wait like a week or so. So that whole week I was thinking, what's going to be in this autopsy report? Are there going to be photographs? Are there going to be, is it going to be, no. An autopsy report is the most banal thing you have ever read in your entire life. And so what it did, it allowed me to, it wasn't traumatizing at all. It's like, he had nice, he had unremarkable was the word that they used throughout the autopsy. He had unremarkable eyes. He had unremarkable brain architecture, which I thought was interesting. He had all these unremarkable things. And when I kind of came to that was like someone for whom life was made difficult because of his body, because what he did with his body. In the end, this categorization, this cataloging of the body is just bits and pieces, just parts. But it contained so much, the locus of so much hate, of so much anger. But in the end, it's just this really banal listing.
It's interesting when you talk about the categorization of the body in that way, because the other document that you use in this is his own salient facts document, right? In which he's talking about his own body as he's experiencing illness, right? And of course, that description of the body, so that you have these two separate and sort of opposing, diametrically opposed descriptions, one that is clinical and one that is clearly subjective, as you say, that even in the autopsy, there was no statement about his HIV status.
My brother, one of the documents I use in here, it's a text that's called The Salient Facts of Patient Michael J. Barnes. And my brother, the lawyer, wrote this, again, like 4 pages, legal pad. And a year before he died, he was experiencing symptoms. He didn't know what it was. And so he had seen 8 doctors in that last year. And so he wrote this document for his last doctor. And so he documents, on this day, I felt this. On this day, I had a sore throat. On this day, I felt like something were crawling up my body. So what he's describing actually is, they are things that people experience who have HIV or who develop into AIDS. But my brother was also a hypochondriac. So he was always feeling like things were crawling up his body or crawling in his body or whatever. And in the end, he says he finally goes to get an HIV test, and while his boyfriend's is negative, mine is positive, and he can't bear the fact of getting dementia, which is a very real fear for people who develop AIDS. And that, in a suicide note, is what he says caused him to kill himself. But when they did the autopsy, and this was in '93, the medical examiner, when they came and talked to my mother and father and I, said he was perfectly healthy. His organs were perfectly healthy, but they didn't do an HIV test, and they don't know why they didn't do an HIV test. So I don't know if what the medical examiner was telling me when she said he was perfectly healthy, is that he did not have HIV, or that he just didn't have AIDS, because he could have had HIV and still been perfectly healthy. He was in, this is 1993, he was right at the beginning of when the cocktail, if he waited, he could have been living because he'd be living with HIV. But I don't believe he had HIV. I think he used it as an excuse to kill himself. I think that was that one thing that allowed him to say, I have an excuse, I can do this. If you know Freud, Freud talks about this, that because of the ego, you really can't, a person cannot kill themselves. The ego will not allow that to happen. The ego is a self-preserving mechanism. So people who commit suicide must project their ego onto something else so that they can kill this thing. So I think that's what he did. He constructed the fact that what his body was this diseased thing, and his ego was someplace else, so he could kill this diseased thing without killing his ego. I think that's what it was.
Actually, I think we don't have too much time left, and I wanted just to sort of close this with this notion that one of the things that I also found incredibly interesting in reading the book is that you intersperse a lot of literature throughout, and so in one way, and the reviewer in Lambda Literary, I think, did a good job of talking about this notion that we're creating our own narrative of our own lives, often as they're reflected in the narratives that we read that we're drawn to, right? And there's a way in which you do this in a conscious, structural way throughout the essays. There's A Boy's Own Story, The Tempest. The one that was most intriguing to me was the one that came at the end, The House of Mirth. Which, in the case in which you're talking about the heroine at the center of the story, which is sort of typical of the time in New York, who is unable to manage her life, unable to manage her fortune, and therefore she becomes almost a kind of outcast in the New York society at the time. And even the man who would be her suitor begins to believe what the others are saying about her and distances himself for a while from her. And she then comes into illness. As we all know, everyone died of consumption then, because they were consumed with their grief and loneliness. And when her suitor finally decides that no, he loves her, anyway, and cannot live without her, by that time he goes back for her and it's too late. And I think what I found most intriguing about that reference as it comes near the end is that you had said in your readings of it prior that you had always identified with the heroine as sort of the tragic character in it. And I think that there is a way that we often in our youth do that as we're struggling through things, that we identify with that character. But now looking at it, you realize that for you, your brother is that character. And that you are the lover that comes back too late. And I suppose the question then sort of arcs us back to the beginning and this sort of discussion about grief, about love and shame, and who survives and who doesn't. If you're in fact the lover that comes back too late, I asked before, about midway through, if you'd forgiven your father. Is this book an attempt to forgive yourself for coming back too late? And if so, have you done it?
That's a good question. It really makes no sense to compare my brother to the House of Mirth. It makes no, on the outskirts, on the face of it, makes no sense. But this is how I did it. So I use, like I said, I use documents. Two of the documents I use are texts. One is The House of Mirth, and the other is Prospero's books, which is a Peter Greenaway movie. And those I consider to be documents as well of influence on this. And the reason I connected my brother's life with the House of Mirth is because when my brother moved to New York, he tried to create a new narrative for his life. I found this out after he died, that his coworkers, my brother had told his coworkers that he was an only child, and that my parents had died, and he was an orphan, and he had a small trust fund. We were lower middle class Midwesterners. So Mike had come here and tried to rewrite his life, to create a narrative that he could live in. And I think what happened in the end, he couldn't live in that story. In the House of Mirth, we had the same thing. We have the heroine who is trying to live in upper class society in Manhattan, which my brother would like to have done. And in the end, she can't, and she accidentally overdoses on a poison, similar to my brother's. So this is how I kind of got at that question of, I used it because I was trying to get at the question of why did this is what I discovered at the end of this book. It wasn't so much a question of why did Mike die, but why did I survive? We grew up in the same household, the same environment, the same kind of toxicity, we were both gay people, and so why did I survive? And I think the answer, I'm going to get to your other question. I think the answer, I'm dancing around it. I think the answer is because I had to endure much more than my brother did when I was a child. And for those of us who survive, who are survivors, we're tough. And we survive. That's what we do. So the other question was, have I forgiven and part of that is, I wanted, when my brother and I knew we were gay, that it brought us close together, and it didn't. It didn't. So I wanted it to be when he was going through this tough time, he would have reached out and called me. He would have sought my help, but he didn't. That wasn't my brother. He never would have done that. So I don't know if it's so much forgiving myself, more than realizing the kind of, that I loved my brother very, very much. And I still do, and it's okay if that's just one way.
Thank you so much, Andy.
Thank you guys for coming. I really appreciate it. Thank you very much.